Like to hand over to John. If you'd like to introduce yourself, John, and also I think you're sharing your slides.
Great, thank you, Janet. Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to come and talk about peak cluster today. So yeah, I will share a few slides, kind of give an overview. Some of you may be familiar with the project. Some of you may have no clue what on earth I'm talking about. So hopefully what I'll do is I'll give you kind of a reasonably broad introduction. I'll try and then shut up so that there's actually opportunity for Q&A, because that's usually the far more interesting part. So just a little bit of background. So I work for a company called Progressive Energy. So we are project developers in the clean energy space. We've been around for 27 years, trying to make carbon capture and storage happen, trying to make hydrogen happen, these kind of large scale transition technologies that are needed for us to ultimately to get to net zero. So we primarily work in the UK. We're increasingly doing some work outside of the UK. We're a relatively small organisation, about 35 people. Quite hard to pigeonhole. We're not consultants. We're project developers. We are passionate about making large-scale material reductions in CO2 emissions from industry and from the wider energy system. We're technology agnostic. We don't own any technology, and we bring together large partners to create those projects that are needed to decarbonise industry and the energy system. Personally, my background is from industry. I was 25 years in the chemical industry before coming in and doing this 6 years ago or so. And so I actually am really passionate about these two challenges that we have of how do we decarbonise, but also how do we sustain industry, manufacturing, good jobs, production here in the UK, rather than what has been largely kind of our journey as a country over the last 3 decades or so of deindustrialisation. So that's, I think the really fascinating, challenging place that we're in. Clearly, yeah, the political environment has changed quite a lot over the last 2 or 3 years, where net zero in its own right is no longer a kind of tick in the box necessarily, but on the other hand, we've seen a pivot with things like industrial strategy becoming back much more into the forefront of the conversation. Infrastructure strategy likewise last year. So I think we're in an interesting place. I think that journey is going to continue as well, and as we try and shift to decarbonisation becoming not just a political necessity but also an economic imperative once again, which I think it will fairly rapidly return to being. Okay. Great. Yeah, so that's me. The other thing you may have come across Progressive Energy, so we were the originators of the HyNet project. So HyNet, one of the 2 track 1 industrial cluster projects, which has started to reach final investment decisions over the last year, and I think is really recognised as a world-leading industrial cluster. It's one of the World Economic Forum industrial cluster exemplar projects as well. So I'm not going to talk much about HyNet, but I may say a few words as we go along. We'll focus more on, excuse me, on peak cluster. Okay, right. Let me see if I can share my slides. He says, hopefully. Okay.
All
somebody
working,
hopefully.
John.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, all good.
Great. Okay, so as I mentioned, peak cluster with our partner project Morecambe Net Zero is around helping to secure a resilient future for a key part of our industry, in this case, cement and lime production. So for I guess a lot of folks, cement and lime is a relatively invisible sector. People tend to kind of know that cement is relatively important, but really don't have a lot of knowledge of where it's made or how it's made. So in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, we actually produce 40% of the UK's cement and lime. So an incredibly important clustering of industry that's been there for literally decades and decades and decades. And so we've brought that production together across 4 big producers. So Holcim, Breedon, Tarmac are cement producers, and Buxton Lime, part of the Sigma Rock Group, as the lime producer, together to address this challenge. And in doing so, have created the world's largest cement carbon capture and storage project, connecting to the UK's largest CO2 store, Morecambe Net Zero. And for some of you, those terminologies may be familiar, for some of you maybe not, and I will try and unpack those a little bit. Okay, so we've brought those 4 producers together, making 40% of the UK's cement and lime, and employing a little over 2,000 people across those sites. With ourselves at Progressive Energy, with another investment partner, Seal, part of the Sumitomo Group, the Japanese conglomerate. Our partners at Spirit Energy developing the store, Morecambe Net Zero. And as some of you may know, in July last year, Chancellor announced investment by the National Wealth Fund into this project, particularly into the development of the onshore infrastructure transporting the carbon dioxide from where it's captured to where it's stored. So that was a very significant first CCS investment by the National Wealth Fund. Okay, so let me keep moving because I'm conscious I do want to do what I said, which is get to the point where you can ask some questions. Yeah, I'm sure I don't need to explain to this group how important cement is, clearly as the key ingredient for concrete, the world's most widely used human-made material, truly foundational. How much cement and lime is made? Well, I've mentioned 40% of the UK cement and lime, but yeah, the cement that's made across those 3 producers is enough for 2,000 new schools, 500 hospitals, whatever, each year. You know, hugely important, very important from a jobs perspective, highly skilled in sites that have been there for a long time. But production of cement and lime is very carbon intensive. Those 4 producers between them emit over 3 million tonnes a year of CO2, which is about a quarter of all emissions from Derbyshire and Staffordshire, not just industrial emissions, all emissions. Yeah, so very significant. So on our journey to net zero, clearly vital that we address these. And this is a really cost-efficient way of tackling emissions by actually working together across competitors. So what are we going to be doing? Well, fundamentally, this is carbon capture and storage. So capture the carbon dioxide from those manufacturing sites before it's emitted to the atmosphere, and then take it for storage. Where are we going to take it for storage? Well, depleted gas reservoir in the East Irish Sea. So the Morecambe gas fields, as some of you may well know, have been producing gas for the UK for the last about 40 years. At one point, they were providing about 10% of the UK's natural gas, and now it's down to a much, much lower rate as the reservoirs are nearly depleted. The gas comes ashore at Barrow in Cumbria. So those gas reservoirs will end production kind of at the end of this decade, and they are then perfect for storing CO2 and have a huge capacity to do that. So capture the carbon dioxide in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, store it in the East Irish Sea, and we need to get the CO2 from one to the other. And so we need to create a transport system, and the most efficient way for these kind of volumes is by pipeline. So new build buried pipeline to aggregate the CO2 from those manufacturing sites in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, transport across to the coast, and then offshore to the reservoirs. Okay, so that's carbon capture and storage. And apologies, some of you may be very familiar with the technology, but for those who aren't, you know, here's a kind of a simple schematic of how it works. So kind of left to right, we build facilities at the manufacturing site. These are large new process units that will capture the carbon dioxide and then compress it. That then goes into the new build buried pipeline, transport across the coast where we anticipate that we'll need to recompress for then its journey offshore to a platform. And essentially at that point, you're doing the reverse of the gas extraction. So the platform is then sending the CO2 down into the geological structure deep below the seabed, where the CO2 will then remain forever. Okay, so that's carbon capture and storage. Okay, where are we in terms of timeline? Well, you know, I'm sure this group is very familiar with how long large projects take to develop, consent, construct. Okay, so we started looking at this opportunity 5+ years ago, go through technical feasibility, working out, you know, what is the right solution for those sites. And then over the last year or so, we've been getting ready to move into the next phase, which is front-end engineering, design, and consenting, and that's where we are now. So I mentioned about that investment from various companies, plus the National Wealth Fund, that enabled us then to move into feed and consenting, which is where we are now. And we just, within the last few weeks, started our phase 1 consultation, because this is a nationally significant infrastructure project. So we require a DCO for consenting. So we're into that consultation process. And we'll be looking to submit the DCO next year, secure determination on the DCO, ideally late 28, potentially early 29, and then get to final investment decision on all stages of the project, so carbon capture, transport and storage, and then move into construction so that we can be in operation by 2032 is our target. And anyone familiar with large infrastructure projects, large linear assets like this, knows that, you know, that's whilst that may feel like a very long timescale, that's actually quite an aggressive timescale. Why? Well, there's lots of reasons why we want to get on with this quickly. One is the fact that every year that goes by, we're putting another 3 million tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, but also there's a significant cost impact of that. I'm sure you're familiar. Industry pays the cost of emissions under the emissions trading scheme. So, you know, that's a significant cost burden on industry. And this is particularly the cement industry is hugely threatened by imports. You know, as a country, over the last 20 years, we've gone from importing about 10% of our cement to now about a third of our cement as a country. And that's on a journey that's continuing with further import terminals announced over the last year. So the faster we can get to the point where we no longer have that cost burden of paying for the emissions, the better. And then also we've got the fact that, as I mentioned, those reservoirs will be depleted by, you know, the end of this decade. And so clearly you can't leave those assets offshore and onshore associated with the reservoir and so on, just sitting idle forever with no revenue coming in. And a decision has to be taken whether those are abandoned or actually repurposed. So the quicker we can switch from using them for hydrocarbon extraction to using them for CO2 storage, the better. So there's lots of good drivers to get on and do this quickly. Okay. So just a few words about the public consultation. You know, some of you may be aware of it. We've now identified a pipeline corridor. So what you see on the screen, kind of right to left, is on the right-hand side where the manufacturing sites are in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, connecting into the pipeline running across Derbyshire and Staffordshire, Cheshire, up the Wirral and going offshore, and then a separate consenting regime for offshore. What the consultation is on the scoping boundary. So this is significantly wider than we would ultimately need for construction. But quite rightly, we consult on a broader boundary, including with options. You can see places where it looks like the pipeline goes two ways. Those are real options. And then we will use that information from this phase 1 consultation to refine the boundary, refine the proposal, along with the EIA scoping, along with ongoing engineering, to a refined proposal for the main consultation that will start towards the end of this year, and ultimately inform the final scope of the DCO. And so we've got a few days left on the consultation, and that is still open. Obviously, as well as the pipeline, the buried pipeline, the other infrastructure we'll be building. Clearly, the biggest piece is the carbon capture facilities. That's on the manufacturing sites. We will have some above ground installations along the pipeline, just like any other gas pipeline does. And we will also have some block valve stations again, similar to gas networks. Yeah. Okay, and we have website, we have a consultation hub, we have an interactive map, we have all of that stuff where people can engage and interact.